what I've learned about the world, the many books and Zoom sessions and lectures that I've given are the place to see what I've learnt about the world. And this could last for days if I summarised all of those. So here I will just pick out two or three small things which have particularly struck me, maybe more so recently. One is that I've learnt that the world is vaguely understandable. Not completely, obviously, but that it is a organization of people and events and structures and sentiments and economies and many other things which has patterns. There have been times when I was taught very strongly as an undergraduate or before that history has no real pattern, that it is a set of random events, and we study each of these events for its interest, but we can't learn much about a more general pattern. There was a big reaction against the pattern makers of earlier historians like Toynbee and Marx and others. And so I learnt, both in history and also in anthropology, that there are no laws. There is no way you can say if A, then B, because there will always be exceptions. And I also learnt that, as Popper and others pointed out, we cannot predict the future from the past because we don't know what we will know in the future, and one accidental piece of new knowledge changes everything. And if 30 years ago I had tried to predict where we would be now, I'd have made many false predictions because, for instance, I wouldn't have known about the rapid development of the internet and social media and the smartphone, and that communications revolution, for instance, new knowledge of how to communicate and how to use artificial intelligence. I wouldn't have even guessed that it was coming along. And people can't guess. My friend Ernest Gellner was in the Soviet Union in the months before the collapse, and he was an expert on prediction of laws, and he was an expert on the Soviet Union, but he didn't see it coming. And hardly anyone saw the great economic crash of 2008. One of my friends did. So we can't foretell the future, and we can't see patterns in the past, and we can't see patterns in other societies. But what I've realized more and more is that is generally true. Even a weather forecast. Yesterday the BBC told me that it was going to be a lovely sunny day, and my wife got out the washing and it rained from time to time. So the BBC couldn't even tell what the weather was as it was happening, let alone in the future. So who are we to be able to predict anything? On the other hand, I've come to realize that there are basic tendencies which govern the world, and those are of the famous kind that I came across two, for example. One was Lord Acton's "All power tends to corrupt." Absolute power corrupts absolutely, but it only tends unless it has become complete. And so, as people have pointed out, like John Stuart Mill, who wrote interestingly on this, you tend to think that if someone is arguing a case and he has large financial interests on one side, then that will tend to influence his judgment. If someone is very large, strong, and quite aggressive in nature at school, there will maybe be a tendency for him to be a bully. And there are many, many tendencies which we can find out. And much of my job in recent years in my writing and research has been to try and see what are the tendencies, not of human beings, though you can look down and see we have a tendency to want to go on living, or a tendency to need to have food or sex or whatever, the drives and needs that Malinowski and others have pointed to, but the tendencies within civilizations. So there is a tendency towards a certain kind of family pattern and social interaction within East Asian societies, particularly China. And there's a tendency towards individualistic and competitive behavior in what I call the Anglosphere in Western societies. So these are strong tendencies which have developed with history, and the tendencies of those kinds you can examine through history, through anthropology, through self-examination, and they tend, I'm sorry to use this repeatedly, they tend to go back over long periods. You can't see a tendency in one act, but when you put a whole lot, so it's a bit like the statistical rules which Durkheim said underlay the random pattern of events. So, as he pointed out in his famous study of suicide, there's a tendency for people to commit suicide then in April. Now, why it was and whether it's still the case, I don't know, but and people didn't think, oh, it's April, I better commit suicide. But for certain underlying forces came together to lead to that outcome. Another example of tendencies is Malthus's second iteration of his laws of population. He said there is a tendency for food to grow slowly, food production, and population to grow fast, and a tendency, therefore, for disasters to occur. But it doesn't always happen. There are exceptions, and we can control that. So that's one thing I've learned, which is that the world has a set of rules and tendencies. A second thing I've learned about the world is that when we look at it, both human beings are both very alike and very different. And that also applies to nations and civilizations. And it's a balance of understanding both those things. They're very alike in the what's called the psychic unity of mankind by some anthropologists. That means that in terms of our genetic structures, our intellectual abilities, and our basic drives, humans, wherever they are, and whatever color they are, and whatever their civilization, are 90% the same, just as we are more than 90% the same with other animals. But we are also fairly different from songbirds or frogs or whatever it is that we are 90% the same as. And so on top of the really basic and important similarities, there are these huge variations, and much of the job of an anthropologist or historian is to look at the differences as well as the underlying similarity. The similarity means that we can really, to a certain extent, understand anyone anywhere, which appears sometimes to be a great problem. But we know at a deep level we are human beings. But everything else, the culture, the society, the political system, the economic system, and the rest, can be hugely varied. And so our perceptions of the world, our linguistic systems, which determine much of how we think, all that means that there are huge differences. And so my job has been to try and control for both similarity and the differences, uniqueness of cultures. A third kind of general thing I've learned about different societies and civilizations is the importance of distinguishing between contrasting these differences and comparing these differences. And this is a methodological approach. Much of my early work was contrast. That is, you take England and you contrast it to India. And India has these features, England has those features, and that's a start. But that doesn't really take you very far. And what you need to do is to move towards comparative work, whereby you look at what is the same and different. And normally you can only do that if you take more than England and India. In my case, I started to look at England, Nepal, China, Japan, America, Europe, and then you can say, well, they are similar in these ways. Japan and England are very similar in their family patterns, but very different in their cultural systems and aesthetics. China and Japan are very different in their family systems, but very similar in their aesthetics and culture. And you get all sorts of fascinating combinations like that. So that kind of approach was really important in developing my understandings of the world. And there's much more, but I think that's enough to show that a study of different civilizations, a study of history combined with anthropology, a study of myself, and a very rich and good education has made it possible to understand some things about the world, which has led me to this series of, I hope, roughly 240 different short musings on what I have learnt about myself and the world, of which this is the almost last one.